The Scopes trial was a court case covering whether an individual Scopes was guilty or not of teaching evolution in public schools in Tennessee. Uh, and Tennessee at the time had a law not allowing the theory of evolution to be taught in public schools. What's important about the Scopes trial is not so much the trial itself, but more importantly, the effects it had on the country in the future, and also the highlights that it had on the schism basically between modernism and fundamentalism. On the eighth day of the trial, Darrow, who was the defense attorney, informed the judge that the defense, Scopes, was changing his plea to guilty. What's important about that is it didn't allow for the full defense of Christianity and conservatism to be heard, or the opposition to evolution being taught in schools. That demonstrated, furthermore, that the trial really was just for show, in an attempt to change the court of public opinion. But again, is the highlighting fundamentalism versus modernism in Christianity, which also very closely paralleled the conservative and liberal arguments in the country politically at the time. Looked over a number of different media sources from that day, newspaper articles, um, and the sources there presented the argument again as progressive versus regressive. Again, highlighting the progressive push in American politics at the time. It Most of the articles looked at evolution as an undisputed fact, and also a backhand attack against traditional Christianity and the inerrancy of Scripture. Basically, the majority of the arguments held that Scripture wasn't necessarily definitive, and a mindset of modernism of the day that God could have created the world, but also used evolution in the process. Again, looking over numerous sources, it's kind of interesting to see the trend between conservative and liberal at the time, and how much it mirrors the arguments today in the media. But a couple cover real quickly. A Washington Post, they did publish a final address of Bryan that he was going to give in court, but didn't because the court case ended early. And although it was all excerpts, it demonstrated a strong argument for keeping the teaching of evolutionism out of the schools. The New York Times had a lot of praise for agnosticism, and a lot of different articles talking about Bryan's childlike fantasy in believing that the miracles and such in the Bible were obviously falsehoods. Also, it is showed the bigotry inherent in elitism at the time. A couple quotes that I wanted to talk about. One from a community reverend, Holmes. Bryan sees the world in two parts, the natural and the supernatural. The world of science is the natural part, and Mr. Bryan sees it as the devil, which covered a lot of or highlighted a lot of the opinion at the time. Also, even from across the pond, in the London Star, severe ridicule of Bryan as being very childlike. And another congregational pastor talking about Tennessee was backwoods, and they allege that they didn't even know about the theory of evolution that far, some 60 years after the theory was given. So such ignorance is colossal. It embraces ignorance of everything. This ignorant, frivolous, irresponsible generation has been bred by modern forces. Now it is up to those forces to devise some means to improve the situation, which obviously is extremely condescending, but also highlights the progressive nature of politics at the time in America, and also very much the modernism argument within the church itself. The Indianapolis Tribune, obviously the Washington Post and New York Times have always been very liberal-leaning organizations. There's a number of different articles and books that can highlight that fact. That's why I looked to the Indianapolis Tribune. Indiana was a fairly, and always has been a fairly conservative leaning part of the country. But even the Tribune used multiple different pastors from Indiana across multiple denominations, including Presbyterian and Baptist. And they all pretty much highlighted that evolution had little effect on true religion, which is certainly a transition from the traditional or conservative fundamentalist mindset of churches at the time. The Evening Star out of Washington, D.C. quoted a Viennese theologian declaring that evolution is true and in accordance with the scripture, which obviously starts to bring a number of questions into play. And finally, the Washington Times, without using any direct quotations, said that 60,000 or 65,000 words have been submitted to the court, although not orally, from scientists saying that evolution upholds the Bible. The reason I looked at all these different sources is they all were very progressive in nature and all looked very negatively on fundamentalism. And it shows a trend, not necessarily nationally, but in the media and among political elites at the time, towards a modern view of the Bible, as well as a very progressive political stance. It's also very interesting that a lot of the arguments that Darrow had for evolution to be taught in schools, primarily that you should be able to teach basically all sides and include science in the equation, has transitioned even just 50 years later to where evolution itself is the primary theory that is taught, and divinity is pretty much left out of the equation altogether.